The Minister of Human Settlements and co-chairperson of the Economic Cluster in Cabinet, Mmamoloko Kubayi, has been attending a forum that is bringing together government and business leaders from around the world to discuss the future global economy in Germany. She joins us now live to talk about that dialogue. Minister, thank you for making time for us. How important was our participation as South Africa at this dialogue?
Good afternoon, Clement, and to your viewers at home. It was critical for us to participate. One, these are global dialogues that mainly, most of the time, actually shapes decisions in multilateral forums. What we had here was mainly Germany also stating their position in terms of global issues. And you'd understand that Germany remains one of the critical trade partners as South Africa. But again, it was a platform where you have academia, you have foreign leaders in terms of people who've been Sherpas. You have ministers, you have prime ministers, you had heads of states who were here, and also our participation as South Africa seen as one of the global leaders or African leaders in terms of our participation in BRICS and the championing work that we did on G20 for the AU to be accepted. So they really put more importance in our participation. They had invited both myself and the president to participate, and the president couldn't make it and said, I must attend on behalf of the country. So it was quite a critical platform for us to be able to participate.
Let's talk about the trade opportunities, because that's what was also discussed, and the need to unlock those. One of the things I realized during the BRICS summit is that the volumes and the value of trade between South Africa and other BRICS countries, for instance, is significant, but they're selling more into our economies, and we're not flooding their markets with our products. How do we balance that trade, and not only within BRICS, but in fact even with some of our stakeholders between South Africa and other countries? Because we can't just be known as the suppliers of raw materials to whether it's China, BRICS, or any of the European markets.
Look, it was critical. It remains critical in terms of the conversations. I mean, we spoke not only on behalf of South Africa, but for the continent. As an exporter of raw materials, we spoke about the issues of the need for beneficiation and bringing manufacturing. But also the issue around carbon rules, or what we will call some of the rules that you'd see even in Europe, where trade rules are changed, and when we look at them, they are likely to disadvantage us as a country and also the continent itself. So the conversation as well quite important. If we are to see the trade balance that we want to see, some of these rules are going to be important. So part of the issue of reforms around trade and access to financing, and also in terms of the architecture of financing globally, in terms of us having to address those, it's one of the things or some of the issues that were on the table for discussion. We did take a deep dive in one of the sessions where we focused mainly on Africa. What does it mean, the transition? What does transitioning mean? But in terms of the cost as well, because when you look at the cost of transitioning, but also the rules in terms of carbon emission countries, where you find Europe says we want everything that is clean, and therefore if you are going to produce things, your manufacturing capacity is not utilization of low carbon emissions, therefore will close out of our market. And those are some of the issues that concerns us, because if those are to be done, means that as much as we are the least carbon emission emitters as the continent, but it does put restrictions because we do not have capacity, for example, as South Africa, to continue and reduce without being in the dark. Yeah. And those conversations had to happen. And that's why it was quite important to listen to the Chancellor when he spoke. And we had an opportunity to engage with him as a country, both in terms of myself being able to say, are they willing to help us as a country, or even agree in terms of global platforms where we are to review and look at what is important currently. And one of the issues that he spoke about is that countries need to be pragmatic, where balancing between global rules, trade, but also the interest of citizens in various countries. So the understanding where South Africa is in terms of load shedding, but also balancing with, yes, we have commitments towards issues of climate change. So there are opportunities for us as a country to continue with that. But there are issues that we still have to address because we can't transition from the dark. But there are opportunities, especially when we talk about the continent as well, where there's no access to electricity. Therefore, we are saying, what is it that we can do to ensure that the country, the continent, is able to utilize this as an opportunity and be able to have access to electricity?
Yeah, and speaking of transitioning, I mean, the European countries continue to fund us to decarbonize. But then if you look at their own unique scenarios, they are beginning to backtrack now from their own ambitious climate goals, given the challenges that they are facing, including, of course, what's happened with the war in Ukraine and the sanctions that are in place and how Russia has responded to those. So what's their position exactly? Do they really understand when you say to them that don't put pressure on us to decarbonize at the rate that is determined by you as the rich countries? Because we also, as you say, have our unique realities that we need to consider, like the energy crisis we have. Are they understanding that?
There are two things. One, the understanding that the current financing availability or finance model or the finances or the available money that is in the market for decarbonization is not sufficient. That's the first thing. Currently, we do have challenges. The commitments that were made in terms of the availability of resources initially and the conditionality of those resources has literally changed, and that's why it will make it difficult in terms of meeting the targets. That's the first thing. The second area, that's what we spoke about it. I think as much as it would not be good to say this, but it comes as a benefit to South Africa to have countries such as Germany experiencing the challenges that are as a result of Russia and Ukraine war. Because out of those, they understood the importance of prioritizing citizens. And German Chancellor actually was quite upfront to say they had to change the rules. They had to change some of their targets because households were not going to be able to afford it. And that's why he spoke about pragmatism and agreeing, and some of the references to what we have said as a country and what President Ramaphosa would have said in various platforms to say it has to be a just energy transition at the pace and the cost that the country can afford. And that is agreed to. And some of the issues, even the relationship between ourselves and BRICS, it was quite interesting that it was understood not only from a transitional point of view, Clement, but also even our participation in BRICS, because the Chancellor, if you look at what he said as well, was more around explaining the relationship between Germany and China. And therefore understanding that they've invested a lot of money in China and there's no way that they're going to pull out. And one of the lessons that, for example, for me, was our need as a country to advocate and communicate better. And more importantly, be clear on where we stand and why we stand there. For example, our participation towards BRICS Summit, there was quite a lot of people who were confused and almost thinking that if we continue with the BRICS Summit hosting, we will be punished by global countries. But when you listen to Germany, when they speak to say, we've invested a lot of money in motor industry, and therefore we export and import between ourselves, the trade relation between themselves and China remains critical, and therefore they can't close out on China. But what worries us in this platform, which I picked up as well, Clement, is around the need to change what is happening in the WTO. And we'll definitely have a conversation with my colleague, Minister Patel, who is the lead person in that area. Because there was a sense that some of these countries, what they want to do is to start having some level of bilateral trade relations, which will close out a lot of countries and will disadvantage the continent. But secondly, what was worrying for me, more importantly, was that for the first time we have an African female leader of WTO. And I got a sense that there's some level of undermining of her. I could be wrong, but some of these reforms that are needed are almost as proposal of undermining WTO's work and responsibility. And that's why for me is that it's very important for us to have participated, pick up of some of the issues. We were one of the people who championed her election into WTO and the support for her to remain, because we want to have an equal footing in terms of trade partnership and trade relations with all the countries. So it's those various issues that are quite important from a perspective where we are sitting as South Africa, but also looking at what other countries are doing.
What changes would you like to see when it comes to the WTO around trade on the continent? so that we can push for that developmental agenda? Because the other argument is that we also are not really realizing our full economic potential on the continent. We're not even taking advantage of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area to advance that even African industrialization. Are we talking among ourselves? Are we moving fast enough to implement this Africa Continental Free Trade Area? Because it's got to start here before we even try to get some of our international counterparts to come on the table.
Look, we are getting somewhere. Remember, the initial process started with Agenda 2063 that identified priority areas. And one of the areas around what we needed to do as a continent, as we say, want to build the Africa we want, was around trade areas. The fact that we could have this African trade agreement and starting to implement, being championed at various levels, yes, there's still issues. It's not easy to get to them. One of the areas we've got to look at other regions, why it's easy. And that's why even the conversation around de-dollarization. But it has to happen in the context, what replaces it? If we are to de-dollarize, when are we going to? It might not be in 5 years' time, but it must be a vision that says in 20 years, for Africa to be able to compete, these are the following. And when you look at Agenda 2063, it identifies those. It identifies the issues around trade. It identifies institutions that need to be done within the continent so that we have capacity. The movement of goods and people, I know in the country the issue of migration is a challenge, but we're dealing with a lot of illegal immigration, besides instead of illegal migration of people. And therefore the movement, seamless movement of people and goods is important, meaning we've got to build infrastructure. When you look at that, it talks about that. So the agreement is a start, Clement, that we've got to acknowledge that it's a milestone that must be celebrated. We took long to get here. Finally, we have an agreement, and what we must push and what the country is pushing as South Africa is its implementation. And that's why the team that is there, led by Minister Patel, it's important the work that they've been doing, and they've been reporting the milestones continuously. And we are seeing some green shoots, and that's why when we sit in platforms like this one, we do not advocate for ourselves as South Africa, but we advocate for the betterment of the continent.
Was there any concern raised around South Africa's approach and position on the war in Ukraine?
Not necessarily. As I say, globally, Clement, we came out, President Ramaphosa came out clearer. And I don't know whether it's because they started to listen to what he was saying, because that's what we've been saying, that we are non-aligned. That's one. Two, it's that we've been very clear about our participation. Every country has the right to be determining itself in terms of its relation. And the example I'm making with currently now, what is happening with Germany. But we had the head of state from Kazakhstan, who was here in the platform, clearly saying they have a relationship, a good relationship with Russia. They do not regret it. They support Russia's work, and no one frowned on it, because he was firm to say, we are a sovereign country. And I think for us, because we are a robust democracy, majority of the time is that the dissent most of the time is within the country based on various interests. Our issue, Clement, is more around articulating why we joined BRICS, firstly. We joined BRICS not only for South Africa, but for the continent. And we wanted to start changing and altering the global platforms because they were not favorable to us. Had we not pushed for the participation of BRICS in the manner that we have done, the reforms that we are seeing in G20 would not have happened. We don't think that if the expansion and the work that we are doing in BRICS did not happen in the manner that we did, would not have seen the acceptance of AU, which we championed as South Africa through President Ramaphosa, being accepted in G20. So we do believe, and we do believe now, with China agreeing to have conversations about the relations and the the reforms that need to happen in the Security Council, it's because of the presence in BRICS. So there's quite a lot that we're gaining as a country, but not for ourselves, but for the continent, that justifies our presence and that the world is starting to pay attention to those.
Okay. Just lastly, Minister, I'm going to ask you, if possible, to put on your hat now as the head of the Economic Transformation Subcommittee in the ANC and ask about this bill that has been put forward by the Minister of Public Enterprises, Pravin Gordhan, the National State Enterprises Bill. As I understand the ANC resolution, it was that SOEs would be moved to their line ministers. But when I look at this bill and what it aims to achieve, it seems to contradict what the ANC resolution seeked to achieve. What's been your reaction and your assessment of the bill as the head of the Economic Transformation Subcommittee?
Yeah, we will be reporting back to the NEC, Clement, but let me just explain. There are two things that we've got to remember as listeners, and obviously we'll be explaining to members of the NEC as well. Prior to the conference, there was a report in terms of the Zondo Commission that came out. When that report came out, there was a commitment by the President that of responding to the issues that have been raised by the Zondo Commission. And that report was submitted to Parliament, and Parliament is utilizing that as a monitoring tool to say, are we compliant with what we have committed to do? Now, this bill or the consolidation at that time was part of what was submitted in Parliament. We have asked for the President to be able to manage that process between what has been said by the conference. If there is a contradiction, but from what we were sitting and looking at that, because it's not taking all the state-owned entities, as Comrade Pravin had explained publicly, to say this is not a whole sale of taking all entities into. Both there is quite a lot of debate I've picked up in the public domain, even those others who are saying, but this model is not even assisting to respond to the State Capture Commission concerns. So there's quite a lot of debate that is still going on. I think at the right time, because we're still processing this matter, Clement, will be, as the ANC, be able to articulate it fully. I just thought, let me explain the originality of where this matter started and where we are. We will, through the Secretary General, be able to communicate and articulate in how our posture is going to be. But it's not contradictory, because both in terms of the state capture response, the NEC of the ANC and the conference did give the President a mandate to be able to implement some of those decisions. All
right, we'll see how you navigate that as the top leadership of the ANC. Mmamoloko Kubayi, Minister, thank you for making time for us.